The 9,714th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Denmark, Latvia, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Miroslav Janča, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia, and Americas, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Janča.
Thank you, Mr. President. On Saturday, 24 August, Ukraine marked its 33rd Independence Day. The day also marked a somber milestone of 2.5 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched in blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. On this occasion, we reiterate the United Nations' full commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Over the past 30 months, millions of Ukrainians have witnessed unimaginable death, devastation, and destruction. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, since 24 February 2022, 11,662 civilians have been killed, 639 of them children. 24,207 civilians have been injured, 1,577 of them children. This July was the deadliest month for civilians in Ukraine in almost 2 years. At least 219 civilians were killed and 1,018 injured. Tragically, these figures only grow as missiles, shells, and drones continue to hit cities, towns, and villages across Ukraine daily. In the past 2 days, hundreds of missiles and drones reportedly killed at least 11 people and hit energy and other critical civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. Damage was reported in 15 regions, with at least 11 energy facilities affected. This vast destruction further aggravates the already precarious access to energy and water for millions of people. Days earlier, on 24 August, amidst escalating fighting in eastern Ukraine, a missile struck a hotel in the town of Kramatorsk, Donetsk region of Ukraine. A Reuters staff member was killed and 4 journalists injured. Similar attacks on hotels, restaurants, markets, and shopping areas in frontline communities have been reported. We are also concerned about the impact of the spread of fighting on the civilian population on both sides of the Ukraine-Russia border, including in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions of Ukraine, as well as in the Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions of the Russian Federation. Following the start of Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region on 6 August, local Russian officials reported at least 12 people killed and 121 others injured. According to local officials, at least 130,000 people have been evacuated from the region. OHCHR has not received additional reports of civilian casualties or related harm and is not able to confirm these reports as it has no access to the Russian Federation and the areas impacted by the fighting. As the Secretary General repeatedly underlined, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable no matter where they occur. These attacks are prohibited by international humanitarian law. They must end immediately. We urge all sides to act responsibly and ensure the protection of civilians. Mr. President, we are alarmed regarding reported incidents around the nuclear facilities in Ukraine and Russia. In August, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, reported deterioration of the nuclear safety situation at Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. On 17 August, a drone strike hit the road around the site perimeter. On 11 August, significant fire at one of the cooling towers resulted in considerable damage. The IAEA team has also reported periodic intense military activity near the plant, including sounds of frequent explosions, repetitive heavy machine gun and rifle fire and artillery at various distances from the plant. Concerns are also rising over nuclear safety and security in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. On 22 August, the Russian Federation informed the International Atomic Energy Agency that remains of a drone were found within the territory of the Kursk nuclear power plant. We welcome yesterday's visit to the Kursk nuclear power plant by IAEA Director General Grossi and his personal efforts to ensure nuclear safety and security in Russia and Ukraine. We also commend IAEA's ongoing monitoring of the situation at all of Ukraine's nuclear sites, including Europe's largest plant in Zaporizhzhia. We continue to call for maximum restraint and vigilance to avoid a nuclear incident, the consequences of which could be catastrophic to the region and the world. Mr. President, after a decade of conflict in the east of Ukraine and occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and following 2.5 years of full-scale war, the suffering of the people in Ukraine continues unabated. Women in Ukraine are facing particular risks. They make up 56% of the 15 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. We are concerned about the reported 40% increase in cases of gender-based violence. In frontline areas, particularly in the east and south of Ukraine, entire villages and towns have been either partially or completely devastated. According to OHCHR, 546 medical facilities and 1,306 educational facilities have been damaged or destroyed. As we have previously briefed, humanitarian operations in some areas lack access to people in need. We remain deeply concerned about the 1.5 million people who we are unable to reach in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. Like all others living close to the front line in Ukraine, they require urgent access to health care and medicine, food and clean drinking water. In accordance with international humanitarian law, it is imperative that impartial humanitarian relief be facilitated for all civilians in need. The hostilities have displaced millions of Ukrainian people who continue to need our support. Nearly 3.7 million people have been internally displaced within Ukraine. More than 6.6 million Ukrainian refugees have been recorded globally. This year, together with our partners, the United Nations aims to reach 8.5 million people with life-saving assistance, including through its winter response plan. So far, donors have provided 41% of the $3.1 billion required under the Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. We thank them for their generous contributions. However, the already dire humanitarian situation is expected to worsen as hostilities show no signs of abating and the winter approaches. Mr. President, we welcome the recent exchanges of prisoners of war facilitated by the United Arab Emirates and other actors. We encourage the sides to step up these efforts to bring all prisoners of war home. However, we express serious concern about the treatment of prisoners of war held by the Russian Federation. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has reported that prisoners of war were subjected to prolonged and routine torture, dire conditions of internment, and repeated sexual violence. Prisoners of war must be treated in accordance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we cannot allow the horrific devastation of this war to become normalized. Now, more than ever, it is critical for us to speak with one voice to ensure protection of civilians and to step up our urgent efforts towards peace. Next month, the world leaders will gather for the Summit of the Future to forge new international consensus on how we deliver a better present and safeguard the future. We hope that this summit will help enhance global collaboration at a time when it is most urgently needed. And we hope that these efforts will also bring us closer to laying the foundations for a just, lasting and comprehensive peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. The United Nations remains ready to support any meaningful efforts to this end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Jančar for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you very much for organizing the meeting today. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Jančar for the briefing. I believe it was useful for the Council to hear the latest on the most extensive conventional war the world has seen in decades. So, Mr. President, in the last 2 days, we were reminded of the viciousness of this war when Russia launched one of the largest combined strikes we have seen since its beginning. Almost 300 drones and missiles hit apartment buildings and energy infrastructure across Ukraine, including reportedly a hydropower plant in the Kyiv region. These unabated strikes against civilian infrastructure are blatantly violating international humanitarian law and need to stop immediately. And there is no sign that the intensity of fighting is decreasing. To the contrary, as Assistant Secretary General Jančar said, the UN recorded more than 1,200 civilian casualties in July alone, which makes it the deadliest month for civilians in almost 2 years. This brings me to my first point. The sheer extent of human life lost to this war, instigated by Russia, is intolerable, and it compels us to look for peace, a just and lasting peace for Ukraine and its peoples. As we pass the 2.5-year mark from the start of the war, it is high time for a peace process to begin. It is obvious that there cannot be peace without the involvement of and dialogue between all parties. In this regard, we hope that the Russian Federation will demonstrate genuine willingness to end the war and engage in good faith negotiations based on international norms and in full respect of the UN Charter. Secondly, as the war keeps on raging, the stakes are getting higher. This is especially obvious with regard to the safety and security of nuclear power plants in the region. At the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, in the span of a single month, we have seen fire in one of its cooling towers, power outages, and a drone strike in the direct vicinity of the plant. The situation is perilous, and it will turn into devastating if the 7 indispensable pillars for nuclear safety and security and the 5 basic principles for the protection of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are not respected. This does not hold just for the nuclear power plants on the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, but other nuclear power plants and civilian nuclear facilities affected by armed conflict as well. So, colleagues, Slovenia welcomes and fully supports IAEA Director General Grossi's activities in this regard. We also believe this Council should address the importance of preventing civilian nuclear facilities becoming a target or object of armed conflict. Any attack on civilian nuclear facility or the prevention of its normal operation could result in an unimaginable long-term humanitarian and environmental disaster. And we are ready to engage in order to prevent this. Mr. President, it is devastating to see this war expanding in the territories it engulfs and in destruction it causes. This, however, does not absolve the Council from its duty to ensure international peace and security, including in Ukraine. Slovenia will not cease with its endeavors to build trust in order to secure the future of Ukrainians and Russians, for that matter, with a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representatives of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Janša, for your briefing. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union. 2.5 years ago, Russia launched an unjustifiable, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and today continues what is a decade-long assault against Ukraine's independence. Ukraine has an inherent right to defend its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity against Russia's aggression. This right is enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Ukraine's people are fighting, defying the Kremlin's attempt to redraw Ukraine's borders by force. They are fighting valiantly and heroically, though Russia continues to brutally strike Ukraine's critical infrastructure, as it did over the past weekend, launching its largest aerial attack since the war began, a volley of hundreds of missiles and drones, killing more than a dozen civilians and damaging energy facilities. In July, Russia hit Ukraine's Okhmedit Children's Hospital. In Putin's war of choice, Russia has forcibly transferred and deported thousands of civilians, including children, and caused 6.4 million refugees to flee the country and another 3.5 million to be internally displaced. There is no justification for these acts. Today, the Kremlin is endangering the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We call on Russia to accede to the demand of 100 of its fellow UN General Assembly members and return control of the plant to the rightful, competent Ukrainian authorities. Russia cannot and will not subjugate Ukraine. The United States will continue to uphold the foundational principles of the UN Charter and support Ukraine against Russia's aggression as it preserves its independence. Ukraine and the United States made concrete progress by signing a historic bilateral security agreement in June. But we are not alone. With the Ukraine Compact, 32 NATO allies and partners pledged to support Ukraine's immediate security needs and maintain Ukraine's long-term defense and deterrence capability. Ukraine's Independence Day serves as a reminder of what is at stake: the fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Our commitment to those principles, like our commitment to Ukraine, will not waver. The The United States will stand by Ukraine as it seeks a just and lasting peace consistent with the UN Charter. And when the world's leaders come to New York next month to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter, they are also reaffirming their support for a basic principle. Russia cannot redraw Ukraine's borders by force. The United States once again calls on Russia to stop its relentless attacks against Ukraine and to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's territory. We hope that next year, Ukrainians will be able to celebrate their independence in peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank the United States and Slovenia for requesting this meeting and Sierra Leone for arranging it. I also thank ASG Yencha for his comprehensive briefing. First and foremost, we join the global community in congratulating all Ukrainians on the 33rd anniversary of their independence on August 24th. Ukraine has been fighting desperately for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, principles enshrined in the UN Charter that no one can undermine. We are concerned about the use of seemingly neutral phrase of so-called war in Ukraine to divert attention from the true nature of the situation. Let me make it clear. This unprovoked war against aggression, this unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has been brought by Russia. This fact remains unchanged, as clearly recognized by the overwhelming majority of the General Assembly. We express our deep respect for and strong solidarity with the Ukrainian people who have been defending their country for more than 2.5 years. Our support has been unwavering from the outset. Mr. President, in addition to violating the UN Charter, Russia continues to disregard the Geneva Conventions. I would like to take a moment to reflect on what Russia's aggression has caused in Ukraine. As we have heard from the briefer today, there have been countless civilian casualties. Families have been torn apart by forced deportations of Ukrainians, including children. Countless critical civilian infrastructures, such as power plants and dams, have been destroyed. The continued occupation of Europe's largest nuclear power plants poses a risk of nuclear disaster. The overall damage has been too extensive to enumerate fully. Despite being a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia continues to violate the related Security Council resolutions it has agreed to, including importing missiles from North Korea for use in Ukraine. Mr. President, the international community must keep united on fundamental principles. We reaffirmed our commitment to the international order based on the rule of law. We strengthened our solidarity based on common values, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as human rights and dignity. To prevent any further attempts to change the status quo by force anywhere in the world, we emphasize once again that Ukraine must prevail and peace in Ukraine must be based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We continue to demand Russia's immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal from Ukraine. We reiterate our unshakable position to adhering to the UN Charter and urge Russia to do the same. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. And I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to ASG Yencha for his briefing. I also welcome the participation of Ukraine permanent representative at today's meeting. On August 24th, it was Ukraine's Independence Day, which should have been a day of celebration of national sovereignty and unity. But sadly, Ukrainians are still suffering from the ongoing conflict that has lasted already for 2.5 years. For the past few weeks, we have witnessed a significant escalation along the battle fronts. Ukraine's military operation within Russian territories was followed by Russia's intensified hostilities, which caused a rise in civilian casualties, the mandatory evacuation of affected areas, and renewed destruction of critical civilian infrastructure. Russia's attacks, including the vile, large-scale one on Monday involving hundreds of missile and drone strikes, continue to threaten all Ukrainians and plunge them into darkness, just as they are approaching the third winter since the war began. At this point, my delegation highlights the following points. First, we are deeply concerned about the ongoing dangerous situation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant following the increased military activities in its vicinity. As a country operating 26 nuclear reactors on its soil and having hosted the second Nuclear Security Summit in 2012, the Republic of Korea joins a call for a halt to any and all escalatory actions that risk a nuclear catastrophe. All parties must faithfully cooperate with the IAEA to prevent such an incident. We appreciate the IAEA's efforts to ensure the nuclear safety and security in the region since the war began. We are also closely monitoring the results of the IAEA Director General's visit to the Kursk nuclear power plant in Russia. Second, as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, we deplore that these landmark global commitments for protecting victims of war continue to be blatantly ignored in Ukraine. Indiscriminate attack against civilians and civilian objects, including energy infrastructure, is in violation of international humanitarian law and must be condemned unequivocally. The mistreatment of prisoners of war and detainees must also stop. And ultimately, those who committed war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine should be held accountable. Third, we support the international community's diplomatic efforts to end this war, in line with international law and the UN Charter, affirming Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Even amid the intense fighting on the ground, we cannot lose hope for diplomacy. At the same time, as everybody in this chamber knows, there is a simple and a shorter path, that is, Russia's withdrawal of its troops from Ukraine's territories. Mr. President, we note with great concern the Ukrainian authorities' announcement that North Korea's ballistic missiles were used again by Russia to strike Ukraine on July 31st and August 11th. Russia cannot cover up its illegal procurement of North Korea's weapons and use of them against Ukraine, which violate multiple Security Council resolutions. We once again strongly urge Russia to fulfill its solemn responsibility as a permanent member of the Security Council by halting its illegal military transactions with DPRK. We also condemn the DPRK for being complicit in Russia's illegal invasion, prolonging the war in Ukraine, and threatening international peace and security in wider regions, including Europe and East Asia. In closing, Mr. President, the Republic of Korea will support Ukraine until they achieve just and lasting peace in their territories, based on our bilateral Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representatives of the Republic of Korea for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representatives of Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Colleagues,
примерно в середине августа аккредитованные при ООН
in
журналисты начали
August,
спрашивать нас,
UN-accredited reporters started
почему
asking us
западные
why
члены
is it
СБ
that
не
Western
торопятся
members of the
запрашивать в
Security
этом
Council
месяце
are in no
заседание по
hurry to
ситуации на
ask for
Украине.
a meeting on Ukraine this month.
Неужели,
Is it,
вопрошали
they
они,
asked us,
США и
is
их
it that
союзники
the United
решили
States
отойти
and
от
allies
практики
decided
искусственного
to give
удержания
up on
на
the
плаву
practice of
украинской тематики в
artificially
Совете
maintaining the
Безопасности,
Ukrainian
вне
issue in the
зависимости
Security
от реальных
Council,
потребностей ее
regardless
обсуждения
of the
Совбезом?
real needs for its discussion by the Council?
Мы,
Of
разумеется,
course,
не
we
могли
could not
отвечать за наших
answer
западных
and
коллег,
provide an
хотя
answer in the place of
кое-какие
our
версии у
Western
нас
colleagues,
были.
even though we do have a version or
Уж
two
слишком
as to
неприглядно
why.
выглядели их украинские подопечные в
Their
ходе развязанной ими как раз в августе Курской
Ukrainian
авантюры.
people
Так, на
looked
самой
very
Украине прозвали
unfavorable
безрассудную
during the
атаку
Kursk
режима Зеленского
adventure,
на мирный
and that
российский
is what
приграничный
Ukrainians
регион.
themselves call the reckless attack by the
При
Zelensky
всем желании
regime
наши
against the
западные
border
коллеги не
peaceful
могли не
region.
замечать
Our Western
сотни
colleagues
свидетельств о том, как на
simply could
территории Курской
not
области украинские
overlook
националисты
hundreds of pieces
расстреливают
of
мирных
evidence
жителей,
showing
пытающихся покинуть
that
район боевых
in
действий,
Kursk Oblast,
включая беременных
Ukrainian
женщин.
nationalists are executing
Бьют по
peaceful
гражданским
citizens,
автомобилям,
including women and children, that
запускают
they strike
беспилотники
against
по
civilian
машинам скорой
cars,
помощи,
that they
журналистам и
launch
волонтерам,
drones
пытающимся
and
спасти людей
ambulances,
от
that
украинских
strike against
карателей.
reporters and volunteers
Сознанием
trying to
дела
save people
занимаются
from Ukrainian
мародерством в российских
executioners, that
селах и
they
магазинах
loot
и выкладывают все это в
Russian
интернет.
villages, and then they post all of that on the internet.
Обстреливают и
They also
уничтожают
shell
гражданские
and
объекты,
destroy
включая жилые
civilian
дома,
objects,
школы и больницы,
including residential
издеваются над
buildings,
мирным населением
schools,
и берут его в
and
заложники,
hospitals, and
демонстративно
they
используя
take
при этом
hostage of
нацистскую
peaceful
атрибутику и
citizens.
символику.
And while they're doing that, they demonstrably
Часть
use Nazi
видеодоказательств этих
attributes and
преступлений мы
symbols.
уже демонстрировали
Some
в ходе
evidence
встречи
for that is
членов
already
Совета
something that we
Безопасности по
have
формуле
shown
АРИА
during the
13
ARIA
августа.
meeting for the Security Council
С того
members on
времени их
13th of
число
August.
только увеличилось.
And since then, their number has only
И
grown.
все это
And
происходит на
this is
территории, где нет
happening
никаких
at the
военных
territory
объектов,
which has
где в
no
основном живут
military
мирные женщины,
facilities,
дети и
which is
старики.
mostly populated by peaceful women, children, and the elderly.
Кроме того, появились
Furthermore,
неоспоримые
there have been
доказательства того, что
irrefutable evidence
киевский режим
appearing that the
сознательно
Kiev regime
обстреливал
is
Курскую атомную
intentionally shelling the
электростанцию и
Kursk
строил
nuclear
планы
power plant
захватить ее
and
в ходе
is
вооруженной
planning to
операции.
take over it during a military
Подобное
operation.
безрассудство,
This kind of
рискующее спровоцировать
recklessness
ядерный
could
инцидент с
trigger a
трагическими
nuclear
последствиями для
incident with
всей
tragic
Европы,
consequences for the entire
является лучшим
continent of
ответом
Europe.
тем,
And this
кто
is the best
пытался и
answer
пытается не
to
замечать атаки
those who is
киевского
trying
режима на
not to notice the
Запорожскую АЭС.
Kiev regime attack
Вот к
against the
чему приводит
Zaporizhia
ваша
NPP.
беспринципная
This is
страусиная
what your
позиция.
unprincipled ostrich-like position leads to.
Подобная показная
This
дикость является
kind
некомфортной
of
даже для Вашингтона,
action
Лондона и
is uncomfortable even
Брюсселя,
for
которые еще
Washington,
в
London, and
2014 году
Brussels.
выдали
Already in
киевским нацистам
2014,
карт-бланш на
they have
любые
given a
преступления.
carte blanche to the Kiev and
Явную
Nazis for any
неловкость у
kinds of
западных спонсоров киевского
crimes.
режима
The
усиливал и тот
Western
факт,
sponsors of the
что
regime
свое
also made
ошеломившее многих в
uncomfortable
мире
by
истинное
the
лицо в
fact
ходе атаки на
that
Курскую
the
область
true colors
киевский режим
of
даже
the
не пытался
Kiev
скрыть.
regime was shown during the attack on the Kursk Oblast and didn't even
Понятно,
try
что
to
все
hide
это
it.
далеко не лучший фон для
Clearly,
запроса
this is not
заседания
the best
Совета
background
Безопасности.
possible
Вот
to
наши
request a
западные
Security
коллеги и
Council
выжидали
meeting,
до
and
самого
that's
конца
why our Western
месяца
colleagues
и
waited
сделали
until the
свой
very
ход
end
уже
of
на
the
флажке,
month and
надеясь,
requested
что
a meeting
замысел
under the
главаря
wire,
киевского режима к
hoping
этому
that
моменту хоть
the
как-то
thinking
прояснится
of the leader of the Kiev
и
regime will become
появятся хоть
clear
какие-то
by now,
позитивные для
and
Украины
there will be
результаты
at
его
least
авантюрного
some positive
решения.
outcomes by now of its adventurous and reckless decision.
Однако смысл
But
самоубийственной
the
Курской
rationale
авантюры
and the reason
просроченного
for this
украинского
suicidal
президента
Kursk
так и не стал
adventure of the
понятен.
Ukrainian president has not become
Результатами
clear
еще
in any
хуже.
way, and the outcomes
По
are
сути,
even worse.
Украина ценой
Essentially,
огромных потерь
Ukraine
живой силы и
has
западной
suffered
техники
greatly in
зачем-то
terms of
удерживает
servicemen and
несколько
material,
деревень в Курской
but for
области,
some reason holds on to
отвлекая
a
на
few
это
villages in
дефицитные
Kursk
резервы, в
Oblast,
том
and
числе с
using for that
восточного
very few
направления, где
reserves,
фронт у
including the ones
вооруженных
taken
сил
from the
Украины
east,
из-за этой
where
стратегической ошибки
because
окончательно
of that
посыпался.
the Ukrainian front is collapsing.
Темпы продвижения
And
там
the
российских
pace
войск
there
существенно
of the
ускорились.
Russian
Каждый день
forces moving is
освобождаются все
growing.
новые и новые
Every
населенные
day we're
пункты Донбасса.
liberating newer and newer
Только за
population
последние дни
centers in Donbass.
освобождены
In the recent
Тимофеевка,
days, we've
Новоселовка
liberated
первая,
Timofeevka,
Веселая,
Novoselovka,
Лисичная,
Veselaya,
Ивановка,
Lysychna, Ivanovka,
Сергеевка,
Sergeyevka,
Свиридоновка,
Sviridonovka,
Желанная,
Желанная,
Межевое,
Межевое,
Артемово,
Артемово,
Камышовка,
Камышовка,
Орловка, Константиновка,
Орловка, Константиновка,
Новогродовка, Калиново, Мемрик.
Новогродовка, Калиново, and Membrick.
В числе прочих недавно
This
освобождено
list
село
also includes the
Новогродское, успевшее при
Novorodskaya
майданной власти
village, which under the
побыть
Maidan
3 года Нью-Йорком.
authorities was being called New York for
Наши
3 years.
подразделения уже вступили
Our
в такие
units have
стратегически
already
важные
entered
пункты,
such
как
important
Селидово и
strategic points
Торецк,
as Selidovo
который
and
скоро станет
Toretsk,
Дзержинском,
which is going
а
to
также
become
Карловку,
Dzержинsk
находится на
soon, and
поступу
Karlovku.
к важнейшему
And we are
транспортно-логистическому
nearing the
узлу в
most important
Покровске, который
transportation
вскоре опять
logistic
станет
hub
Красноармейском.
in Pokrovsk, which is going to then become Krasnoarmeysk.
Средняя площадь
The
ежедневно
average
освобождаемой
territory
территории в
of
августе
the
выросла
territory
более чем в 2
liberated
раза по
daily in
сравнению с
August
июлем
grew
и
twofold
составила
compared to July
11,2
and
квадратных
became
километра.
11.2 square
Последние
kilometers.
же дни этот
And
показатель вырос почти
recently
до 30
it has
квадратных
reach the level of 30 square kilometers.
При этом важно понимать,
It's important at
что
the
в
same time to
отсутствие у
remember
ВСУ
that in
переброшенных
the
в Курскую область
absence of
резервов, сейчас
reserves which
российскими
are
войсками
being used
освобождаются
in the Kursk
последние опорные
Oblast,
пункты,
well, now the
которые ВСУ
Russian
последовательно
forces
укрепляли и
are freeing up
удерживали еще с
the last
2014 года.
strongholds that the Ukrainian
И
forces
это только
used to
начало.
hold since 2014,
Расплачиваться
and
за
this is
Курскую
only the
авантюру
beginning.
Украине еще все придется
Ukraine
сполна.
will have to pay for the Kursk adventure
Поэтому мы
in
прекрасно
full.
понимаем, с
We
каким
understand,
тяжелым
therefore,
сердцем
full
запрашивали
well
сегодняшнее
that
заседание
the
западные подельники
request
режима
for the
Зеленского.
meeting today by the Western co-conspirators of
А ведь
Zelensky
США и их
regime was done with a
сателлитам
heavy
нужно еще и
heart.
держать в уме тот
The
факт,
US and
что ВСУ в
satellites at the
Курской
same
области
time
воюют с
need
западным
to bear in
оружием.
mind the fact
Своего
that
ведь у них уже
the
не
Ukrainian
осталось.
armed forces in
Используют и
Kursk
теряют
are
немецкие и американские танки
fighting
и бьют по мирным
using
городам из
Western
западных артиллерийских
weapons. They
установок
use
и
and
ракетных
lose
систем
German and
залпового
American
огня.
tanks and shell
А в курских лесах и полях
using
воюют и гибнут западные наемники и консультанты, без которых
Western
ВСУ ничего предпринять уже не
artillery.
могут.
And there in Kursk you also have
А
Western
это значит, что
mercenaries and
соучастие западных
consultants.
стран в
And this
преступлениях
means that the
киевского
Western
режима стало
participation
еще
in the
более
crimes of the
очевидным для
Kiev
всех.
regime has become even more
Эту
obvious for
тему
one
мы
and all.
подробно обсудим
And this is
30
something we're going
августа
to
на
discuss on the
заседании по
30th
поставкам
of August
западного
at
оружия на
the
Украину.
meeting on Western weapons supplies to
Поэтому ожидать
Ukraine.
от США и
Therefore,
их
expecting that
союзников
the
по НАТО
United States and
какой-либо
its
объективной,
NATO
да
allies
попросту
are going to be
человеческой оценки
objective or even
действий украинских
humane in
убийц и террористов и
assessing what is being
мародеров
done by
было
the
бы
Ukrainian
наивно.
murderers and terrorists
На
would be
такие случаи у
naive.
западных коллег
But
заготовлена
for
заезженная
such
пластинка
reasons, our
о
Western
праве Киева на
colleagues do
самооборону
have
и
the
защиту от
formula
российской
about
агрессии.
the right of Kiev to
Сегодня эти
self-defense and
слова в этом
protection
зале
from
звучали
Russian
особенно
aggression.
фальшиво. Я
And we
думаю,
have
еще
heard
прозвучат.
these expressions today in this room. They sounded false and we'll
Правда,
continue hearing them.
представитель США
The
сегодня
representative
утром
of the
заявил в
United
этом
States
зале,
this
что,
morning
цитирую,
stated in
«Никто
a
из членов
quote
Совета
that
Безопасности,
no
сталкиваясь
one
с
member
жестокой
of Security Council,
террористической
when
организацией на своей границе,
encountering a
не
terrorist
потерпит
organization on its
ежедневные
border,
атаки и
will
не
not
будет мириться с
tolerate daily
перемещением из
attacks and
этого
will
района
not
десятков тысяч своих
tolerate
граждан».
displacement of tens of thousands of its
Но
citizens
такая позиция США
from that area.
зарезервирована
But
исключительно
such
для
a position the
Израиля.
United States
На
have, but
преступления
it's
против
reserved for
России и
Israel
русских в целом в
exclusively.
Вашингтоне давно
When
уже
it
не принято
comes
обращать
to
внимание.
crimes against Russia and Russians, Washington has not been paying attention for that for a
Господин
long time.
председатель,
Mr.
у
President,
безрассудной курской
this
авантюры
reckless Kursk
украинского
adventure
президента есть еще одно практическое последствие.
undertaken by the Ukrainian
Как вы
president has
помните, в
one more
июне президент
consequence.
России
You will
выступил с
recall
мирным
that in
предложением
June,
в
the
адрес
president
Украины,
of Russia put
отражающим
forward
реальную
a peace
ситуацию на фронте
proposal on
и
Ukraine. It
учитывающим
reflects a
генезис
realistic
украинского
situation on the
кризиса.
front and takes into account the
Какое-то время
genesis
после
of the
этого
Ukrainian
риторика
crisis.
киевских главарей стала более
Sometime
миролюбивой,
after that,
и
the
многие
rhetoric
из
of
наших
the
коллег из
Ukrainians has
стран
become more
глобального юга
peace-loving, and many of our
поспешили сделать
colleagues from
опрометчивый
the
вывод о том,
global
что мы подходим
south
к этапу
rushed
мирных
to the
переговоров.
conclusion that we're reaching
Коллеги,
the
те
state
из
of
вас,
peaceful
кто так
negotiations.
рассуждал, не
Those of
учитывали
you who thought that
недоговороспособность
way did
киевского
not take
режима,
into account
которую
that
он
the Kiev
проявлял
regime
как в
cannot
случае с
enter into
Минскими
any kind of an
договоренностями,
agreement.
так и с
This
проектом
was
мирного
shown in the case
договора,
of the Minsk
ратифицированного в
agreements
Стамбуле в
and also the
2022
peace
году.
agreement which was initialized in Istanbul.
И на сей раз
And
киевский
this
режим,
time as well,
обманув
the Kiev
всех тех,
regime
с кем вместе
deceived
рассуждал о мире,
everyone who talked
четко
about
выбрал
peace together
эскалацию,
with them.
напав на
Instead, they
Курскую
decided
область
for
и снял таким
escalation.
образом
They
все
attacked the
вопросы.
Kursk Oblast, and all of the
Надеюсь,
questions
больше
were removed
никаких
this way.
иллюзий ни у
And
кого
I
на
do
этот
hope
счет
that
не
no one
осталось.
is left with any kind
У
of an
нас их и не
illusion,
было.
therefore.
И
We
поэтому
never
мы
had
продолжаем
them, and
выполнять
that's why
цели
we
нашей специальной военной
continue
операции военным
implementing the
путем,
targets of a special
устанавливая
military
на Украине мир,
operation,
в котором режим Зеленского не
instilling peace on
заинтересован.
Ukraine, which is something that the Zelensky regime is not interested in.
Уважаемые коллеги, в
Colleagues,
завершение
in
хотел бы
conclusion,
призвать
I
всех
would
тех
like you to
членов
call
ООН,
upon those
кого Вашингтон
members
и его
of
союзники
UN
сегодня активно пытаются завлечь в
who
геополитические игры,
Washington
подкупая
and
элиты
allies
и
are
настраивая
trying
их
to
против
bring into
своих
their
соседей
geopolitical
и
games
других
by
влиятельных мировых
bribing
игроков.
elites. And
Посмотрите на незавидный пример Украины, и вы
please take a
поймете, к
look
чему это
at
может
the example
привести.
of Ukraine, and you will see what this kind of
Самой
policy can
богатой из
lead to.
постсоветских республик с внушительным промышленным
Ukraine was
потенциалом,
the
она почти
wealthiest of
сразу
post-Soviet
перекочевала в
republics with
разряд
great
одного из
military
самых бедных
potential, and
государств
it
бывшего СССР.
now became one of
Разрушила
the
свою
poorest states of the
экономику,
former
промышленность,
USSR. Its
распродала
economy is
земли
destroyed,
алчным западным
its industry
корпорациям,
is
стала
destroyed, its
полигоном
land is
для
being sold to Western
американских
corporations. It
биолабораторий, а
became
теперь
a
еще и для
platform for
испытаний
American
нового западного
biolaboratories,
оружия и
and now
утилизации
is a
старого.
platform for the testing of Western
Внедрение
weaponry
же так
and use of the
называемой
old one.
демократии западного образца
Introducing Western-style
привело к полному
democracy
отсутствию
has
свободы
led to
слова,
the total
а с
absence
недавних пор
of
и
freedom of
вероисповедания.
speech or even
Тысячам
freedom of
политзаключенных,
religion recently,
установление
to
диктатуры
thousands of
президента,
political
который не
prisoners, to the
только не
dictatorship
выполнил
of
ни
a
одного своего
president, the
предвыборного
president who
обещания о
not
мире,
only did not
но и довел
implement any
страну
of
до
its
самоубийственной войны
promises
с
of
Россией за
peace,
западные
which
геополитические
he
интересы,
made before the
в
election,
которой
but
Украина
that is
играет
contrary
роль
to
частной военной
suicidal war
компании.
with Russia
А в итоге глава киевской
defending
хунты еще и попрал и
Western
растоптал
geopolitical interests.
Конституцию своей
And the
страны,
result of that,
отказавшись
he
от проведения
also,
выборов.
in addition to that,
И сегодня бросает
trampled
бессмысленную
underfoot
мясорубку сотни
the
тысяч своих
constitution
граждан,
of his
по
own
сути,
country
исключительно для
and
того,
is
чтобы удержаться у
throwing
власти.
into the meat grinder hundreds of thousands of its nationals just to keep onto power.
Вот настоящий
This is
неутешительный
the
итог,
true
с которым Украина
sad
подошла к
outcome
33-й
that
годовщине своей
Ukraine has
независимости.
achieved
Вот
by
цена тех ошибок
33rd
и
anniversary of
просчетов,
its
которые были
independence. That
допущены
is the
украинским
cost of the
руководством в
mistakes
угоду
and
Западу.
blunders made by the Ukrainian leadership so as to please
Видимо,
the West.
осознавая это, в этом
And
году
probably
западные
understanding
страны, в
that
отличие от
this year the
предыдущих
Western
лет,
countries,
даже решили
in
обойтись без
contradistinction to
каких-либо
previous
акций
years,
в поддержку Украины в
decided to even
штаб-квартире ООН в
forego
Нью-Йорке в
any
этот
kind of
день.
action in support of Ukraine
Вместо этого западные
at
спонсоры киевского режима
UNHQ
предпочли
this
провести
day.
время в
Instead of that,
благополучной Женеве,
they decided to
обсуждая
spend time
юбилей
in the
МГП,
well-off Geneva,
положение которого их
discussing
украинские
the
подопечные как
anniversary
раз
of
в этот момент грубо
IHP,
нарушали в Курской области.
which were being at the same time violated in Kursk.
Хочется верить, что
I would like to
спровоцированные
say
США
that
и
we
их союзниками по НАТО кровавой
believe
украинской
that the bloody
трагедии,
Ukrainian
все, кто
tragedy
могут
provoked
оказаться в
by the
подобной
United
ситуации,
States and
извлекут
NATO,
надлежащий
and
урок.
that this will serve as a
Благодарю за
lesson for
внимание.
anyone who could potentially end up in a similar situation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank ASG Yancha for the update provided and welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, the European Union, Romania, Denmark, Poland, and Latvia in today's meeting. Mr. President, while today's meeting was convened to discuss the political and security situation in Ukraine, we will be remiss to not speak at the outset about the ongoing violations of international law. Violations that continue to bring death and destruction to civilians on both sides as the war spreads farther away from the front lines with each passing day. Each month, we continue to receive alarming reports of civilian casualties, mostly occurring in Ukraine. Since February 2022, over 34,000 civilians, men, women, and children, have borne the brunt of thousands of attacks. July, Mr. Yancha reminded, has been the deadliest for Ukraine. We deplore the continued attacks against civilians and civilian objects, despite numerous calls by this Council and the General Assembly for full adherence to international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. We demand an immediate end to all attacks targeting civilians and civilian objects, and indeed call upon the parties to the conflict to desist from launching such indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks. We also stress the need for accountability for all such violations. Guyana further demands that the conflict parties take constant care to protect civilians and civilian objects from harm, and all necessary measures to minimize the risk of civilian injury, death, and damage to civilian property. The status quo cannot allow to continue. Every UN member state has an obligation to abide by the UN Charter and the wider body of international law. Mr. President, with each life lost, each family torn apart, and each home bombed, anger and hatred spread, and the prospect for peace diminishes. Guyana therefore stresses the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. Prolonging it will only exacerbate the risks and consequences for all concerned and further threaten international peace and security. As I have stated previously, innocent lives cannot continue to be sacrificed at the altar of political brinkmanship. We must choose peace. We therefore reiterate our call to the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We urge them to engage in good faith to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children who have already paid too high a price. Mr. President, as we have just heard from ASG Yancha, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is dire. It will only get worse as the winter season approaches. Guyana urges the international community to give increased attention to the plight of the 14.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, and to scale up support for the humanitarian needs and response plan. We call for continued international support for the victims of this war, including medical, psychological, and legal support, with particular attention to children and survivors of sexual violence. We further stress the need for access to be granted to the people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance in the occupied territories. We call upon the Russian Federation to grant humanitarian access to all populations in need in these territories. Guyana also calls for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana will continue to support all efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful and sustainable end to this war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank ASG Yancha for his briefing. Since the Ukraine crisis fully escalated in February 2022, 2 years and a half have passed. These 2 years and a half have witnessed protracted fighting on the ground, deteriorating humanitarian crisis, and ever-unfolding spillover effects. This is tragic and worrisome. Since the beginning of this month, the war has taken a new turn, with both parties to the conflict thrown into a new round of fierce fighting, leading to severe casualties and infrastructure damages. The endless protraction of the war will bring nothing but more harm, more damages, and finally, a lose-lose outcome, making an already turbulent world even more unpredictable. In view of the increasingly severe and complex situation, China has repeatedly stressed on many occasions that the current priority is to follow the principles of no spillover of the battlefield, no escalation of the fighting, and no fueling of flames by any party, with a view to achieving de-escalation as soon as possible. We welcome the new round of prisoners exchange between Russia and Ukraine under the good offices of UAE. We once again call on both parties to stay calm, exercise restraint, abide by IHL in real earnest, and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure or nuclear power plants and other nuclear facilities for peaceful purposes. We call on all parties to the conflict to demonstrate political will, move towards each other, cease the fighting, and launch peace talks at an early date. We call on the international community to uphold an objective and impartial position, and to this end, create favorable conditions and provide concrete support. President, despite the twists and turns on the path towards peace, China has been committed to working for peace and promoting talks. As long as it is conducive to alleviating the situation and facilitating negotiations, China is there making its efforts. Recently, the Chinese government's special representative for Europe and Asia visited Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia for the fourth round of shuttle diplomacy on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. During the exchanges, all parties highly commended the six-point consensus proposed by China and Brazil on the question of Ukraine. They all expressed worries about the escalation of the conflict and unanimously called for early launch of peace talks. China is ready to continue its close communication with the Global South and other relevant countries and make unremitting efforts towards a political settlement. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that on the question of Ukraine, China has always maintained that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed, that the reasonable security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and that all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of crisis should be supported. Based on the above-mentioned four principles, the four shoulds mentioned above, China will continue to work for a political settlement. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, presidente, y agradezco al subsecretario Yancha por su detallada exposición informativa. Nos encontramos en un momento crítico con desarrollos recientes que han agravado aún más las tensiones y la inseguridad en la región. La intensificación de las hostilidades no solo sigue cobrando vidas inocentes, sino que agrava la crisis humanitaria en Ucrania, donde más de 14 millones de personas, incluidas 32 millones de niños, necesitan urgentemente asistencia. El Ecuador rechaza toda acción que agrave agrave la violencia y genere mayor sufrimiento a la población civil. Los ataques deliberados contra civiles y bienes de carácter civil, como hospitales, escuelas e instalaciones humanitarias, son violaciones flagrantes del derecho internacional y deben cesar inmediatamente. La protección de civiles, en su amplio sentido, debe guiar cualquier respuesta en el contexto de este conflicto, pues la santidad del derecho internacional humanitario debe ser preservado. Incluso en tiempos de guerra existen normas de cumplimiento obligatorio. De igual manera, la seguridad nuclear es un asunto que merece nuestra máxima atención. Es inaceptable cualquier actividad que ponga en riesgo la integridad de las instalaciones nucleares en Rusia y en Ucrania. Me hago eco del llamado del director general del OIEA a que se respeten los 7 pilares indispensables de la seguridad nuclear durante un conflicto armado y los 5 principios concretos establecidos para proteger la central nuclear de Zaporilla, pero aplicables a cualquier central nuclear. Es imperativo que estos principios sean respetados para prevenir un desastre humanitario y medioambiental de escala incalculable. Señor presidente, es preocupante la intensificación de la violencia y el creciente riesgo de escalada que amenaza con desestabilizar no solo la región, sino también la seguridad global. Mi país reitera, tal como lo ha hecho de manera sistemática, que como miembros de esta organización estamos obligados a respetar los principios universalmente aceptados y el derecho internacional, porque lo contrario comporta consagrar el latinismo interarma silent leges, es decir, la derrota de la ley por medio de las armas. De ahí la importancia de recordar, sin ambigüedad, el párrafo 4 del artículo 2 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, que prohíbe a los miembros de la organización recurrir a la amenaza o al uso de la fuerza contra la integridad territorial o la independencia política de cualquier Estado. Este principio es uno de los pilares del orden internacional que todos hemos acordado proteger y promover. Señor presidente, excelencias, colegas, es imperativo trabajar en favor de la desescalada, la contención y el cese de las hostilidades. No debemos permitir que la guerra se normalice. Es crucial revitalizar los canales de comunicación y explorar opciones de negociación basadas en el diálogo y la diplomacia, siempre en estricto respeto a la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras internacionalmente reconocidas. Para terminar, es responsabilidad primordial de este Consejo mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales, por lo que instamos a sus miembros a actuar con determinación en plena adherencia a los principios de la Carta para poner fin a este conflicto devastador, objetivo para el cual pueden contar con el apoyo del Ecuador.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et je voudrais, comme mes collègues, remercier le sous-secrétaire général, Monsieur Yencha, de son intervention. En début de semaine, les Ukrainiens et Ukrainiennes des différentes régions du pays se sont de nouveau réveillés au son des sirènes d'alerte et des explosions. Les attaques massives de la Russie contre les villes et les réseaux électriques de ces derniers jours ont, une fois de plus, fait des victimes et causé d'importants dégâts. La Suisse condamne les frappes persistantes sur les infrastructures civiles énergétiques. Ces événements nous rappellent que 2 ans et demi après le début de l'agression militaire, les pertes humaines, la destruction de foyers et l'effondrement de toutes les certitudes se poursuivent sans relâche. Dès le début, la Suisse a condamné sans équivoque l'agression militaire de la Russie contre l'Ukraine. Celle-ci est une atteinte aux règles et principes fondamentaux inscrits dans la Charte
principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. A few days after the anniversary of its independence, I reaffirm Switzerland's firm support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. After 30 long months, and as we watch with concern the particularly intense hostilities and tensions in eastern Ukraine and in the border areas, three areas of action require our immediate attention. Firstly, respect for international humanitarian law must be an absolute and non-negotiable imperative. We have just commemorated the 75th anniversary of Geneva Conventions. Together, we recalled the universal commitments undertaken, in particular the protection of the civilian population and their property needs to be ensured according to OHCHR figures. And as Assistant Secretary Yencha pointed out, last month was the deadliest for civilians in Ukraine since October 2022. On average, every day, a school, hospital, or a medical facility is damaged or destroyed in Ukraine. Switzerland urges all parties to the conflict to comply strictly with their obligations, including those arising from the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. Every violation of international humanitarian law is unacceptable. Second point, efforts to achieve accountability must continue. Investigations of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and the prosecution of international crimes are essential to restoring justice. Switzerland supports accountability efforts at both national and international level, in particular the work of the International Criminal Court. In this regard, we welcome Ukraine's decision to ratify the Rome Statute. Its full accession to the statute is crucial for the ICC to deliver justice to victims and deter future atrocities. We also stress the need for holistic support for victims and their families. Initiatives such as the Register of Damage, as well as special attention to psychological needs, are essential. Third point, it is essential to advance peace in accordance with the UN Charter. We urge all those involved
à œuvrer de manière
to work
concrète et
concretely and
constructive vers un processus de paix, visant une paix juste et durable, fondée sur les principes fondamentaux du droit international. La Suisse reste déterminée à soutenir ces efforts et souligne sa conviction que la paix passe par le dialogue. Nous réitérons l'appel lancé lors du sommet sur la paix en Ukraine aux parties concernées pour qu'elles garantissent, entre autres, la sûreté et la sécurité nucléaire. Il est crucial d'entamer un échange pour aboutir à des mesures concrètes à ce sujet. Le droit international humanitaire ainsi que les 5 principes établis par l'AIEA dans ce Conseil doivent être respectés. Monsieur le Président, laissez-moi conclure avec les mots d'un couple ukrainien. Nous avions tout ce qu'il nous fallait, mais maintenant, nous sommes simplement heureux d'être en vie. J'exprime la solidarité de la Suisse avec le peuple ukrainien qui subit depuis trop longtemps les ravages de cette guerre. Pour la paix et la sécurité internationale, celle-ci doit prendre fin. Nous renouvelons donc notre appel urgent à la Russie pour qu'elle cesse toutes les hostilités et retire ses troupes du territoire ukrainien.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenca for his briefing. At the outset, I would like to express Algeria's deep concern over the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation induced by the military operation both in Ukraine and Russia. The situation continues to be driven by the logic of escalation, aiming to strengthen military position on the ground. In the meantime, civilians continue to be affected by this conflict, with the increasing loss of civilian lives and suffering, as well as the worsening humanitarian situation. More concerning is the absence of any foreseen peaceful political solution or prospect of desescalation. Confrontation and polarization remain, unfortunately, the main drivers of this conflict. Against this backdrop, Algeria would like to make 3 critical points. First, it's urgent to reverse the trend and to de-escalate tensions by ceasing hostility and abiding by international law and international humanitarian law. Attacks against civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure are unequivocally prohibited by international law. Second, the continued polarization of this crisis remains a source of concern for Algeria. It contributes to prolonging the crisis by nurturing escalation between the parties, with adverse repercussions on international peace and security. Third, this escalation should go hand in hand with intensifying diplomatic efforts to get the parties around the table for an inclusive and constructive dialogue and negotiations. Only this way could guarantee a peaceful settlement of this conflict, where the purposes and principles of the UN Charter are upheld and the legitimate security councils of both parties are met. Mr. President, we believe that whatever the reason and motivations leading to a conflict, the party and the international community should never take it as irreversible. As soon as dialogue is genuinely engaged, peace may emerge for the darkness of the most intricate confrontation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank ASG Yencha for his briefing. Colleagues, as we discuss the situation in Ukraine today, we are once again compelled to highlight the continued barbarity of President Putin's tactics against the Ukrainian people. Last weekend, Ukraine marked its third Independence Day since Russia's illegal invasion. Instead of celebrating, Ukrainians were fighting for their country, their land, and their families. They are also fighting on behalf of all our countries, in defense of the principles on which this institution, the United Nations, was founded. That every member state has the right to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and borders cannot be withdrawn by force. Let us be clear. Under Article 51, Ukraine has a right of self-defense. The UK and other allies fully support Ukraine in exercising that right. President Putin thought Kyiv would fall within days. He was wrong. And Ukrainian courage continues to prove him wrong every day. Russia is getting increasingly desperate, as we heard again today, and as it does, the attacks become more cowardly. On Monday, Russia launched a wave of missile and drone attacks across Ukraine, striking numerous civilian areas. Further attacks took place on Monday night and Tuesday morning. At least 7 people were killed and many more injured. We were deeply saddened to learn that a British national, Ryan Evans, was also killed in recent attacks. Over 35,000 civilians in Ukraine have been confirmed killed or injured since Russia's invasion began. These most recent attacks represent continued evidence that Russia is intentionally targeting civilian energy infrastructure, risking further humanitarian crisis this coming winter. To be clear, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects constitute a war crime. At the same time, the consequence of Putin's miscalculation for the Russian people is increasingly evident. This week's attack alone cost Russia almost $1.3 billion. It is estimated that more than 1,000 Russian troops were either killed or wounded on Monday alone. So once again, we call on Russia to end its illegal invasion and immediately withdraw its forces. The UK, along with our international partners, will not falter in our support for Ukraine. We will stand with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes to secure a just and sustainable peace based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie M. Janka pour son exposé. Le peuple ukrainien, et avec lui la communauté internationale, a célébré le 24 août la 33e fête de son indépendance. Une indépendance que l'Ukraine défend courageusement depuis plus de 900 jours. Le 24 février 2022, la Russie entamait sa guerre d'agression contre un pays souverain qui ne la menaçait en rien. Depuis, les Ukrainiennes et les Ukrainiens exercent avec courage leur droit légitime à défendre leur souveraineté et leur intégrité territoriale. À travers cette lutte, ils mènent un combat pour défendre les buts et principes de la Charte des Nations Unies. 2 jours après cette célébration, la Russie a lancé contre les infrastructures énergétiques ukrainiennes l'attaque de drones et de missiles la plus massive depuis le début du conflit. Elle a conduit une nouvelle attaque dans la nuit du 26 au 27 août. Après 30 mois de guerre, elle continue de cibler les civils et les infrastructures civiles. Cela doit cesser. La Russie doit respecter le droit international humanitaire et mettre un terme à son agression. Monsieur le Président, les Nations Unies ont établi des faits accablants commis par l'armée russe. La commission d'enquête internationale indépendante sur l'Ukraine a documenté un recours généralisé et systématique à la torture et aux violences sexuelles. La France renouvelle sa condamnation des déportations illégales d'enfants ukrainiens. Cette année encore, le secrétaire général a inscrit la Russie sur la liste d'infamie de son rapport annuel sur les enfants dans les conflits armés. Elle continue de se rendre coupable de meurtre, de mutilation et de transfert illégaux d'enfants. Monsieur le Président, la France s'est mobilisée dès les premiers jours de l'agression russe pour que les auteurs de crimes commis en Ukraine soient identifiés et poursuivis et leurs crimes documentés. Elle continuera de soutenir le travail de la Cour pénale internationale et des juridictions ukrainiennes. Elle salue l'autorisation donnée par le Parlement ukrainien de ratifier le statut de Rome, ce qui facilitera les enquêtes. À quelques semaines du sommet du futur, alors que les dirigeants du monde entier s'apprêtent à se réunir autour du secrétaire général pour discuter de notre avenir commun, la Russie doit cesser de déstabiliser encore davantage un monde sur lequel pèsent déjà de graves menaces. Le chemin vers une paix en Ukraine est simple. La Russie doit immédiatement retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien dans ses frontières internationalement reconnues et mettre fin à son agression. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. And I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank ASU Genka for their briefing. More than 2 years in, Russia's war on aggression against Ukraine continues to demonstrate disregard for global peace and security, international law and multilateralism. As we speak, hostilities in the northeast of Ukraine continue unabated. Recent attacks in Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson and Sumy regions are impacting civilians, causing damage, suffering and destruction to Ukraine and her people, who continue to suffer the brunt of war on a daily basis. Specifically, the security situation in the Donetsk and Sumy regions has significantly worsened in recent weeks, with intense shelling by Russian forces against various cities. This escalation has led to the loss of 16 civilian lives, 22 others have been injured. Furthermore, local authorities have issued a mandatory evacuation for families with children in Pokrovsk as Russian troops approach. This underscores the severity of the threats faced by those living in the frontline communities. No place in Ukraine is safe. On 20 August, an attack targeted a children's cafe in the Zaporizhzhia region resulted in the loss of a 14-year-old boy and severe injuries to 6 other children. This attack further increases the mounting toll on civilian casualties, including children, due to Russia's use of banned weapons such as cluster munitions and explosive weapons in populated areas. As we have heard today by our briefer, July was the deadliest month since the start of Russia's war of aggression. Malta calls upon all parties to respect international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the humanitarian workers risking their lives to provide critical assistance in these challenging circumstances. President, Malta is deeply concerned about the increasing attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine by Russian forces, including the recent strike on 22nd August against a transit center for newly displaced people in Pokrovsk. This resulted in serious damage and the eventual deactivation of the site due to security concerns. We stress once again, civilians are not a target. Children are not a target. Civilian infrastructure is not a target. Humanitarian facilities are not a target. They are all protected under international humanitarian law. We welcome the recent exchanges of prisoners of war facilitated by the United Arab Emirates and other actors. We encourage the sides to step up these efforts to bring all prisoners of war home. We remain firm in our belief that those responsible for perpetrating serious crimes under international law must be held accountable. Perpetrators cannot and must not go unpunished. To this end, we reiterate our full support to the mandate of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as to the register of damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. To conclude, President, Malta will continue to call for the full respect of the UN Charter in response to Russia's war of aggression. We also reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Janša for his insights. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, it is more than 2 years that our repeated calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and de-escalation have remained disregarded. This total disregard for peace is deeply troubling. Civilians continue to bear the brunt of the war as the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law and the rules of war, including the tenets of UN Charter, are consistently and flagrantly violated on a daily basis. This is unconscionable. Given the gravity of the situation, we wish to emphasize the following critical points. First, the military approach has proven unrealistic and untenable as a means to resolve this conflict. Its escalatory nature now threatens the wider region, potentially leading to devastating consequences for Europe and the world at large. Second, we strongly urge the warring parties to recommit without delay to confidence-building measures. It is imperative that the underlying grievances that have led to this calamitous state of affairs be addressed decisively through dialogue and honest negotiations. Third, we call the contesting parties to cease hostilities without delay and resume direct negotiations without preconditions. We insist that there is simply no other way left other than to engage in meaningful and constructive dialogue in good faith. Lastly, we call for the scrupulous respect of humanitarian safeguards and for the parties to ensure the safe passage of civilians and unhindered delivery of essential supplies to all affected areas. To conclude, Mr. President, Mozambique reiterates its firm conviction for a political and negotiated solution as the only viable way to end this conflict and lay the foundation for lasting and sustainable peace between the two neighboring countries. Where there is a will, there is a way. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Sierra Leone. Colleagues, I thank Slovenia and the United States for requesting this meeting, and I thank ASG Miroslav Janča for his helpful briefing. I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which continues to deteriorate and escalate. The conflict in Ukraine has been ongoing for 2.5 years with no seeming end in sight, but with increasingly high numbers of casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure. In recent months, the conflict has escalated drastically, and the battlefield has expanded as Russia has reportedly intensified its offensive further to the northeast, and Ukraine reportedly continues to expand the battlefield in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. This escalation and purported gains on both sides reaffirm the fact that a military solution to the conflict in Ukraine is clearly not feasible and underscores that dialogue and negotiations represent the only viable means to resolve the conflict. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the seeming strategic approach to annex territories, and we therefore reiterate the UN Secretary General's previous statement that, and I quote, "Any annexation of a state territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law." End of quote. We also recall Security Council Resolution 2202, reaffirming its full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In a similar manner, we affirm the full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. In view of the above, we urge all parties to create conditions conducive to holding direct talks at the earliest possible time frame and to actively work towards de-escalation until ceasefire can be achieved. As we navigate the various complexities of the conflict, including the political context, it is important that we also continue to highlight the security situation, which continues to deteriorate with devastating impact on the civilian population. In the past week, civilian casualties and injuries have reportedly risen in both Ukraine and Russia-controlled areas. In addition to the July deadliest numbers, between 22nd and 25th August, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine verified that 6 civilians were killed and 32 injured in Donetsk Oblast, as well as 14 civilians casualties in Samska Oblast. As we reported, the continuous attacks have also damaged numerous civilian facilities across Ukraine, and Russia attacks have reportedly continued to target Ukraine electricity and gas facilities, as well as sites it claimed to be storing Western weapons. For instance, the recent reported attacks across 15 regions in Ukraine caused serious damage to infrastructure, leaving 250,000 families and business entities in Samska Oblast without electricity, disrupted water supplies, and damaged railway infrastructure. One of the last remaining power stations, a hydroelectric plant north of Kiev, was one of the latest targets, and the damage reportedly is still being assessed. As Ukraine approaches its third winter since the start of the conflict in February 2022, these attacks on energy infrastructure continue to inflict severe suffering on millions of people. Sierra Leone reiterated attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Colleagues, we know that to address the winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community launched the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million United States dollars to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance, as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. The plan intends to supply timely preparedness and response. Sierra Leone calls upon the international community to support this plan with fiscal assistance to address the pressing needs of the people, enhance living conditions, and ensure access to essential services. Let me close by reiterating that based on the sacrosanct nature of the UN Charter, and its principles, including on the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states. We call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the Russian Federation, within their internationally recognized borders. Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic effort in pursuit of a peaceful resolution involving the parties to the conflict. We therefore welcome the exchange of prisoners of war facilitated by United Arab Emirates. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate cessation of hostilities. We urge parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be brief. The representative of the Russian Federation, who once again left the room immediately after delivering a package of mis and disinformation, lies, and propaganda, bragged about liberating Ukraine, parts of Ukraine, and in essence, taking possession of these parts of Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is not Russian territory to liberate and take possession of. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent state and will remain so. The U.S. and its allies will continue to help Ukraine in its self-defense. Russia's efforts to redraw Ukraine's borders, as many UN member states have said, are a clear-cut violation of the UN Charter. While Russia, and let's not forget, a permanent member of the Security Council, continues to drive a stake through the heart of said charter, the U.S. and other like-minded member states will continue to uphold the charter and oppose Moscow's brutal war of aggression. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. And I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Assistant Secretary General Yencha. I also recognize the continued occupation of the seat of the Soviet Union by a lonely, sad junior staff member of the Russian mission. The beginning of the week was again marked by Russia's intense and massive missile and drone strikes against Ukraine. Primarily our critical energy infrastructure, industrial facilities, and residential buildings. On Monday, August 26, Russia launched at least 109 drones and 127 missiles of various types, cruise, ballistic, and air ballistic, on 15 Ukrainian regions and on the capital city, Kyiv. The defense forces of Ukraine were able to intercept 102 missiles and 99 drones. Yesterday, on August 27, Russia launched 81 drones and 10 missiles on 16 regions of Ukraine. 60 drones and 5 missiles were shot down. We reiterate our gratitude to all allies that contribute to enhancing Ukraine's air defense and thus saving the lives of people. At the same time, the missiles and drones that were not intercepted caused severe damage and increased the number of casualties. One of the victims was killed in their apartment in the city of Lutsk following a drone attack. Footage clearly shows that before the strike, the drone sustained no external interference. It was not jammed or intercepted. It first reached an altitude of 100 to 150 meters, locked onto the target, and began on its precise trajectory towards it. Among the Russian targets hit on Monday was the Kyiv hydroelectric power plant and its dam. By attacking this facility, Russians continue to dream of repeating what they managed to do in Kakhovka in June 2023. That is to destroy the dam and to flood the territories downstream along the Dnipro River, in this case the capital of Ukraine and its outskirts, the most densely populated areas of Ukraine. Mr. President, for over 2 years, Ukraine has been withstanding the largest aerial terror in human history. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has launched over 9,600 missiles, nearly 14,000 attack drones, and more than 33,000 guided aerial bombs. Just imagine this number of deadly weapons dropped on our homes, schools, hospitals, power stations. The costs of these attacks are difficult to calculate. On August 26 alone, Russia spent about $1.3 billion shelling Ukraine. This money might have been spent on improving the life of ordinary Russians. According to the United Nations, a quarter of them have never had access to centralized sewage systems. However, we are speaking about Russia and its criminal regime, the regime that has plunged its country into a profound crisis. The elements of the Russian crisis include a complete disregard for human lives, both of its own citizens and those of other nationalities, a lack of humanity and morality, and growing inadequacy both internally and on the international stage. That is why Russia opts to spend its revenues on killing Ukrainians. Among the most recent appalling attacks was a strike on a supermarket in the center of Konstantinivka, Donetsk region, on August 9. The Russian missile killed at least 14 civilians, including 3 children, and injured 44 others. On August 20, a Russian artillery shell struck a children's playground in the village of Malokaterinivka, Zaporizhzhia region, killing 1 child and injuring 3 other children. On August 25, Russia deliberately targeted a hotel in the city of Kramatorsk, Donetsk region, with an Iskander missile. A Reuters team, along with local residents and workers, were among those who suffered from the strike. Unfortunately, a safety advisor from the UK was killed, and 2 journalists were injured, one of them seriously. These are just a few of Russia's barbaric war crimes. All of them must be condemned and punished. Mr. President, there is a clear distinction between the parties in this war. Russia attempts to annihilate Ukraine, which is why it targets residential buildings, stores, and critical infrastructure. Ukraine wants to stop the violence and to diminish Russia's capacity to attack. Therefore, we aim at legitimate military targets, including places of concentration of Russian troops and equipment, arms and fuel depots, and logistics centers. Recently, Ukrainian forces attacked military air bases, Savasleika in Novgorod region and Marinovka in Volgograd region. These attacks damaged or destroyed combat aircraft and weapons, including guided aerial missiles. We will continue to eliminate Russia's combat potential, regardless of the threats Putin's representative makes here and the fakes he spreads. Responding to him is a waste of our time and UN resources. He does not influence the decision-making process in his country. His capital does not take into account his reports, even if he ever reported the truth. Therefore, I would rather address members of the Security Council who, despite tolerating the toxic presence of the Putin's envoy in the chamber, realize the scope of the threats to both international security and the credibility of the Council. We urge you and all partners to consider two specific decisions to help us put an end to Russian terror sooner. First, to acknowledge Ukraine's right to long-range strikes on all legitimate military targets throughout Russian territory. Second, to engage partners' air defense capabilities to shoot down missiles and drones close to their airspace. None of these steps are escalatory. On the contrary, they will deter Russia, reduce terror and the number of casualties. At this moment, Russia has put everything on the line to advance in Donbass. All traditional methods are being used by Russian military commanders, including continuous meat grinder assaults and complete destruction of settlements to a moon-like surface. Currently, Russia is razing to the ground the city of Pokrovsk in Donetsk region, aiming to advance on the ruins, with no residents and no intact buildings. This is what Russia calls liberation of Donbass. Dozens of Donbass cities and villages have been completely destroyed and depopulated during these liberation. Ukraine will continue fighting against this current-day barbarism everywhere, including in the territory of Russia. That is why Ukraine could not stand idly by observing Russia's military buildup in Kursk region and its preparations for attack on Ukraine's Sumy region, similar to the Russian offensive on Kharkiv from the Belgorod region this May. Responding to this danger, Ukraine launched a defensive operation in designated areas of the Kursk region. Due to these preventive actions, the immediate danger of occupation of Sumy has decreased. The dictator's confusion has been evidenced by the fact that he could not find the strength and courage to appear before the public for several days. Recently, an unpleasant truth was revealed about poorly equipped and inexperienced conscripts abandoned by their commanders and readily surrendered, and about the mass looting of local residents and businesses, properties by Russian soldiers. In the past, Russians infected by propaganda dismissed similar videos of Russian looters filmed in Ukraine as fake. Now they are shocked by video footage from the Kursk region, where Russian soldiers were again stealing, this time from their own fellow citizens. While carrying out the operation in the Kursk region, the Ukrainian army strictly adheres to international humanitarian law. We also have no political plans regarding these areas that contradict the UN Charter. I would like to underline that the goal of the operation is strictly defensive. At the same time, Ukraine establishes military administrations to ensure order and normal life for the local population. Ample video footage, as well as reports by the international media, give proof to the humane treatment by Ukrainian servicemen towards the local civilian population, as well as towards Russian prisoners of war. The latter are safe in Ukrainian captivity, and Ukraine is ready to ensure their swift exchange for Ukrainian POWs. Sunday's exchange proves our resoluteness to bring all our soldiers and illegally detained civilians out of Russian captivity as soon as possible. Unlike the humane treatment by Russian Russian POWs by Ukraine, our servicemen captured by Russia face cruelty and torture. Unfortunately, more crimes against Ukrainian prisoners of war have been recorded recently. For instance, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine is investigating footage which appeared on August 17 and shows soldiers of Russia's 155th Naval Infantry Brigade with what appears to be a severed head of a Ukrainian serviceman put upon a spike in the background. We are extremely concerned about the fate of Ukrainian servicemen in Russian prisons, as they remain subject to ill treatment and torture, leading to death. In July, Ukrainian POW Alexander Ishchenko, former soldier of the 12th Special Forces Azov Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine, was killed in Rostov detention facility in Russia. According to a forensic report made in Ukraine, his death was caused by blunt force trauma to his chest, multiple rib fractures, and shock. Torture in captivity, including with fatal outcomes, is a deliberate and sanctioned practice by the Russian side. As recently stated by Daniel Bell, the head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, in an interview with a Dutch television, I quote, "Torture is regular and widespread, affecting over 95% of prisoners," end of quote. At the same time, she emphasized that the treatment of Russian POWs in Ukraine is entirely different and international access to them is ensured. We remain convinced that the Security Council should address the appalling situation with the ill treatment and torture of Ukrainian POWs by Russia. We also reiterate the inadmissibility of Russia's excluding Azov servicemen from prisoner exchanges and demand this shameful practice be stopped. Mr. President, Ukraine remains committed to the peace process aimed at ceasing violence, hostilities, and violations of international law. The comprehensive, just, and lasting peace should and will be based on the principles of the UN Charter. This is the core of the Ukrainian peace formula, the implementation of which is well underway. The expanded meeting of the Working Group on Energy Security took place on August 22nd to discuss the contribution to the peace framework to be presented at the Second Peace Summit. This conference on energy security has opened a series of events aimed at implementing the agreements reached at the inaugural Peace Summit in Switzerland. We encourage all peace-loving states to engage in further process and contribute to the restoration of international law and the multilateral security architecture. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Armenia, Azerbaijan, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, aligned themselves with this statement. I would like to kick off by thanking ASG Janša for your briefing. Coming after a new series of massive Russian attacks, it once again reminded us, as if reminding was necessary, of the dramatic consequences of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, unjustified aggression against Ukraine and its people. Last Saturday, exactly 2.5 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, millions of Ukrainians celebrated their Independence Day. A hard-fought independence, one that Russia has been trying its utmost to undo by sheer force for 2.5 years. One that Ukraine, on its part, has been forced to exercise its inherent right of self-defense to protect, to restore its territorial integrity, and to protect its existence as an independent, sovereign country and member of these United Nations. Under international law, Ukraine has the right to take actions to protect itself from Russian attacks. Under international law, Russia must fully abide by the order of the International Court of Justice of March 22 and immediately and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. While Ukrainians courageously defend their country, Russia further intensifies its attacks on civilian infrastructure, including Ukraine's energy sector. Not only does it not withdraw its troops, it is intensifying its illegal attacks. According to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, July was the deadliest month for civilians in almost 2 years, with at least 2,019 killed, over 1,000 injured, 60 children included in those numbers. We repeat our call on Russia to immediately and unconditionally halt its systematic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure, which violate international humanitarian law. On Monday, in one of its largest airstrikes since the beginning of its aggression, Russia hit the Kyiv hydroelectric power plant. The UN has repeatedly documented Russia's targeting of energy infrastructure, as well as its use of so-called double-tap strikes, where it uses high-precision weapons to strike the same location twice within a short interval, causing additional casualties among civilians and first responders. Russia, dear colleagues, shows a similar disregard for the welfare of civilians in the areas it temporarily occupies by unlawfully impeding the delivery of humanitarian relief. The UN has frequently highlighted the challenge of reaching civilians in areas currently under temporary Russian occupation. This means an estimated 1.5 million people are being cut off from humanitarian aid. In accordance with international humanitarian law, Russia must facilitate full, safe, rapid, unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. We furthermore remain deeply concerned about the fate of all Ukrainian children unlawfully deported and transferred to Russia and Belarus. Mr. President, Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by the war. Ensuring accountability for violations of international law is necessary to deliver justice for ongoing atrocities and can deter future ones. A lack of accountability, on the other hand, only emboldens the aggressor and its accomplices. I reiterate the EU's support for the comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the UN Charter. To this end, Russia, the aggressor, must end its war of aggression and withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. Other countries must refrain from any actions that may amount to complicity. The EU welcomes the outcome of the Summit on Peace in Ukraine in June. We ask all countries to continue supporting a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. President, allow me to close by reaffirming once again the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity with its internationally recognized borders. Every country's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, certainly Ukraine's. We will continue to support Ukraine and to defend the UN Charter in response to Russia's illegal aggression, and we will do so for as long as it takes. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to thank you and the Council for the opportunity to speak and participate in today's meeting. I also want to thank ASG Jancha for the briefing. Mr. President, this week, members of this Council just returned from a visit to Geneva to mark 75 years since the adoption of the Geneva Conventions. And today, these commitments undertaken by the international community in the aftermath of the Second World War continue to be seriously undermined. And we do fail to put a stop to the suffering civilians, innocent victims of aggression. We reiterate the need for the United Nations humanitarian personnel to be granted access to distribute life-saving aid for the benefit of the Ukrainian civilians. Their protection from indiscriminate attacks is a must. Mr. President, for more than 2 years and a half, Ukraine is making use of a legal provision from the UN Charter, its inherent right to self-defense. Peace needs to be built on the UN Charter and the basic principles of international law. Romania supports the peace initiative of President Zelensky as the only way to a just and lasting peace. We hope for this promise of peace to deliver results before the end of this year. Failure in this endeavor will result into another difficult winter for Ukrainian civilians. Disruptions in heating might trigger another wave of internally displaced persons or refugees in wintertime. We remain very concerned about the continuation of attacks by the Russian Federation against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure of Ukraine, endangering the population of Ukraine and neighboring states alike. I would also like to address the issue of nuclear safety. The resolution called Safety and Security of Nuclear Facilities of Ukraine, including the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, adopted last month by the General Assembly, called for the immediate cessation of attacks by the Russian Federation against critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which increase the risk of a nuclear accident or incident at all nuclear facilities of Ukraine. We reiterate this imperative and our support for the work of the IAEA in ensuring nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. And another message that my delegation would like to register is the following. There is no space for irresponsible actions towards or at nuclear facilities. Mr. President, peace in Ukraine cannot be realized without accountability. Both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court made pronouncements in line with their mandates, and they must be fully respected and implemented. We continue to strongly support their judicial activity and call for respect of their independence. Lastly, as our leaders are preparing to come to the United Nations next month for the Summit of the Future, we need to recommit not only in words and in spirit, and not as a slogan, but through meaningful action to the lofty objectives and principles of the UN Charter. This aggression continues to be as unjustified today as it was 30 months ago, and this will not change with the passing of time. Principles are non-negotiable. The only variables are our actions and our behavior, and there is a strong need to reverse the current trend and restore the full respect for the UN Charter. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. We thank Assistant Secretary General Genscher for this briefing. On 24 August, we mark the 33rd anniversary of Ukraine's independence, a day dedicated to celebrate Ukraine's own unique history, culture, and identity, but also the right to freely choose its own future and aspirations. The Nordic countries remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Just 48 hours after the Ukrainian Independence Day, Russia launched a major missile attack on the regions of Kiev, Odessa, Vinnytsia, Kremenchuk, Dnipro, and many other regions, targeting civilians and critical infrastructure. This once again shows Russia's blatant disregard for international law. We strongly condemn such heinous attacks. These massive airstrikes are among the worst since the onset of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression. President, Russia's goal remains to subjugate Ukraine. In the areas it has temporarily occupied, Russia has brought death, terror, and destruction. No one wants peace more than Ukraine, whose people continue to suffer the consequences of Russia's aggression. But it cannot be peace at any cost. At the Peace Summit in June in Switzerland, more than 100 countries and international organizations from across the globe came together to reaffirm the support for a peaceful resolution based on international law, including the UN Charter. The summit reconfirmed widespread international support for the peace process and conveyed strong political will to solve concrete challenges on food and nuclear security, persons deprived of their liberty, and deported persons. The summit's joint communiqué echoes a common message conveyed in the countless statements made in the Council and the 7 resolutions passed by the UN General Assembly. We all have a shared responsibility to work towards promoting a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the UN Charter Charter and in line with Ukraine's peace formula. President, last month, the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution on safety and security of nuclear facilities of Ukraine, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Nordic countries welcome the continued engagement by the UN community in working towards peace in Ukraine, as demonstrated by the adoption of a resolution on this important matter. Despite this, Russia's systematic and detrimental attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure continue unabated. Russia has again chosen to weaponize supplies of energy and critical energy deliveries. The Nordic countries are firmly engaged in Ukraine's peace formula, point 3, on energy security, and we are committed to support Ukraine in the rebuilding of its energy infrastructure. We reiterate that attacks targeting civilians and civilian objects are strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law and must stop immediately. With 14.6 million people already in need of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, we are confronted with a harsh reality. Unless Russia immediately halts its attack and the energy infrastructure is rebuilt quickly, there will be grave consequences for the civilian population during the fast approaching winter. In closing, the Nordics once again reaffirm our unwavering support to the founding principles of the UN, including the inviolability of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We call on Russia to cease all hostilities and withdraw troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, allow me to start by congratulating Ukraine on the occasion of its Independence Day, which was celebrated just a few days ago. To quote the President of the Republic of Poland, Andrzej Duda, who visited Kiev on the very day, we are here today to show that neighbors stand with Ukraine, that Ukraine is not alone, that we are not afraid, end of quote. The war waged by Russia should remind us all that independence, which many of our societies take for granted, in fact is not given for free, and sometimes it must be defended at a very high cost. Mr. President, it is regrettable that despite a significant number of councils meeting during the last 2.5 years, there is no breakthrough in the discussion due to Russia's continued illegal and barbaric war against Ukraine. The harsh reality is that Moscow is not planning to stop it anytime soon. The recent massive attacks from the air involving hundreds of missiles and drones, which struck various locations throughout Ukraine, give a clear picture of the aggressors' intentions. In this context, let me inform you, distinguished members of the Security Council, of repeated violations of Polish airspace, and thus the NATO airspace, by Russian air assault, which Poland strongly condemns. Recently, we have seen a significant intensification of such actions. They destabilize the European security environment and pose a threat to infrastructure, civilian population, as well as air traffic. We urge Russia to stop its attacks against critical infrastructure and appeal to all states to redouble efforts to ensure energy security of Ukraine, including nuclear energy infrastructure. This could include, for example, providing air defense around the critical infrastructure, spare parts and power generators, as well as increasing energy exports. Poland once again condemns in the strongest possible terms continued heinous attacks against Ukraine. Moscow shows that total disregard for humanitarian law, which results in thousands of civilian casualties and injuries. Mr. President, on a general note, Russia's aggression against Ukraine stands in stark contrast with our efforts to build a stable and peaceful world based on respect for universal principles and international law, with the UN Charter at its core. It is crucial that the international community has no doubts. Moscow aims at replacing this noble concept with an alternative where sheer military power is the basic principle in the relation between the states. Such an approach to international relations is not and should never be accepted. We also want to highlight broader implications of the Moscow actions, contributing to economic instability and threatening security not only of Europe, but also of the other regions of the world. Mr. President, Ukraine has every right to defend itself and protect its citizens and sovereignty, taking all necessary measures in compliance with international law. It is our common duty to support the victim of the aggression in defending its basic rights stemming from the UN Charter. Given the current circumstances, any temptation to turn to the policy of appeasement should be decisively rejected. Freezing the conflict will not bring the lasting peace in Ukraine, as Russia will use the pause to regroup for another attack. Illegal actions which are being continued must be condemned, not rewarded. There is only one way to end this conflict. Russia must withdraw its forces from Ukraine and stop the aggression. And I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representatives of Poland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. We thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenča for the briefing. Yet again, Russia has attacked Ukrainian cities and people. On Monday, 26 August, Russia launched 127 missiles and 109 Shahed combat drones. Attacks that took place right after Ukraine's Independence Day this past weekend have kept most of the country under strain for 8 hours. This is assessed to be the largest Russia's air attack since beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, targeting Ukrainian capital city of Kiev, cities of Lviv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and others. Again and again, Russia has deliberately targeted civilian and critical infrastructure, residential buildings, hospitals, gas facilities, electric power plants, including unsuccessful attempt to destroy the dam of the Kiev hydroelectric power station. This energy infrastructure is crucial for supply of basic services to people in their homes, schools, and hospitals. On August 14th, 2 humanitarian workers died in a Kherson hospital after being injured by Russian shelling. Last week, Russian forces attacked a hotel in the city of Kramatorsk, killing Reuters staff member and injuring 4 other international journalists, including a Latvian journalist. These are blatant violations of the international law, including the UN Charter. The Baltic states strongly condemn Russia's criminal actions amid Russia's full-scale illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We call upon aggressor to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also call on Belarus, Iran, and the DPRK to stop their assistance to Russia to conduct its cruel war against Ukraine. Belarusian armed forces have concentrated significant number of military assets along the border with Ukraine, which is an unwarranted escalation. The Baltic states joined the call of Ukraine to withdraw Belarusian forces from the Ukraine state border. We remain ready to further limit Russia's ability to wage war and urge all countries not to provide any material or other support for Russia's war of aggression. Mr. President, Russia and its leaders must be held accountable for the crime of aggression through an international tribunal that enjoys broad support and legitimacy. We fully support and urge the international community to implement ICJ binding order to hold the military offensive by Russia against Ukraine and ICC arrest warrants issued to Russia's top political and military leadership. The Baltic states support Ukraine's peace initiative and encourage other members of the United Nations to join it. We welcome the outcome of the Peace Summit held in Switzerland this June and encourage all countries to continue supporting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. In conclusion, let me reiterate that the Baltic states strongly support Ukraine's exercise of its inherent right for self-defense and reaffirm our full solidarity with Ukraine to restore territorial integrity and sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
My family is in Russia.